Hello. In this DCS tutorial we'll go over air-to-air combat in the P-51 Mustang. Besides some advancements in gun sights, World War II pilots had very little help for aiming. It was just them, their aim, and how they maneuvered their planes. In this tutorial we'll go over how to operate these gun sights in detail in the P-51, as well as give you some help in maneuvering your plane. Hopefully these tips for dogfighting will give you what you need to put you on the road to becoming an ace. Let's start out with some close-range air-to-air gunnery using the basic gun sight. In the air-to-ground tutorial we covered how to turn on the basic gun sight, and in my experience this is the best, or at least for me, the easiest to use in close-range encounters. Here we're going to be attacking some cargo planes. Currently there are not World War II bombers in DCS, but when they are added you'll have gunners to worry about. However, since the gunners on each World War II bomber are different, it's not very practical to be able to go over what ways to approach enemy planes that way. So we'll just be coming up right behind these cargo planes. Now, this sight can be used for rather long range sniping if you know what you're doing and have practiced with it, especially on a flying straight cargo plane or bomber. It can be very easy. However, you should always remember that your guns work best at a much closer range, although there is a sweet spot for where the bullets converge, as your machine guns are set to have a convergence point. Finding this point at the range it is can be very useful in taking down planes much faster. Feel free to push your engine power to the max to keep up with enemies, as long as you keep an eye on your engine instruments. Now let's skip forward where I'm caught up with the enemy planes in this example. Now one important thing to remember is to make sure you pull away from enemy planes whenever you're catching up with them, because many times you can overtake them very quickly. In dogfighting you never want to overshoot your target, but in attacking bombers or cargo planes it can happen much easier. Here you'll notice that I strafe the target as I pass it, shooting it and making sure I'm constantly moving to the left to make sure that I pass it instead of just flying straight at it. This is a good habit to get into so you don't get too focused on the enemy and run into the back of their plane. Now when you're passing a cargo plane or bomber in an example like this, an easy way to slow down to get back behind it is to do some sharp turns back and forth, and if that doesn't work and you're still pulling your throttle back, you can angle your nose upwards, maybe use a little bit of flaps, I don't really need them in this example, and then bank to the side that's necessary just to kind of slowly move yourself back behind them. Almost going into a stall is dangerous, so make sure you keep your airspeed up, but just use an angle to slow yourself down. Here I'm going to come back for a second pass since I only got one engine last time. As you can see, I just nailed his fuselage and seemed to hit a fuel tank of some sort. Now one thing that this tutorial has not touched on so far, and that can't be helped very much, is how to spot your targets. All of this really depends on both the resolution of your monitor and how you have your model visibility set. Now before we go over anything else for the gun sight, let me just give one more tip. And that is to try to put your gun sight in close range on the engine of a cargo plane or bomber. The engine is much more exposed than anything in the fuselage is, and much less armored. Even though multi-engine planes means you have to destroy multiple engines to be able to cause them to fail. It's just a little bit easier when you're in close range to target individual engines, and in some cases it can shoot down the plane faster, although this does depend on the plane and how many engines. Now let's go over the advanced dogfighting mode or compensating mode provided by the K-14 gun sight. To use the advanced dogfighting mode, once you're switched to it, all you have to do is know the target wingspan. And in order to set the target wingspan, you simply use this dial right at the top of your gun sight and slide it to where your target wingspan would be in feet. Once you have that set, you want to set the range of the target, which you do in real life by twisting the throttle in the P-51 and in-game to whatever you have the keys bound to. I have it bound to my throttle for slight enhancement and realism, and you can see right here on the side of the gun sight me adjusting the range. Now luckily you do not have to actually know the range between yourself and the target, but that is determined by placing the dot on the gun sight on the fuselage of the enemy plane and adjusting it so that the diamonds encircling the dot are just on the tips of the wingspan of the plane. Built into the gun sight of the P-51 are the calculations necessary for it to be able to determine where your bullets will go at that particular range according to your movement as well. I'll skip ahead to where I'm caught up with this plane. And here, as you see, as I take a few shots at this cargo plane, I have to keep adjusting the range as I get closer. Now this is very easy on a target like this, but in dogfighting it's good to have some practice doing this because the range changes a lot faster. And your gun sight will become practically useless if it's not adjusted to the right range. Now the K-14 gun sight has one last trick up its sleeve, and that's that you can use both the advanced dogfighting mode and the basic gun sight both at the same time. You do this by simply switching to that mode right here. And as you can see, I have both of them up at the same time, and it's very useful because it kind of gives you an idea of just how hard you're pulling G's or how fast you're turning really. And whenever you zoom in on your gun sight in the middle of a dogfight, you can kind of lose perspective on how fast you're turning. And it's pretty useful for those who like both gun sights like me or who like the basic. Now you see this lever that I pull on the side here. That lever declutters your gun sight so that it's easier to see. As you can see, all I have is the small crosshairs there and not the circle and everything else for the basic gun sight, which can make it a little bit easier to see targets that are further out in the distance. And I do like this because I prefer the basic gun sight, but also recognize the fact that the advanced gun sight gives some pretty good benefits for fighting at long range. Now this tutorial can't really cover dogfighting maneuvers in detail. Dogfighting is an art of war with many advanced strategies and tactics. Performing a low yo-yo or using boom and zoom tactics serve to enhance or improve dogfighting skills, not create them. A beginner should practice and steadily and patiently try to follow an enemy plane to learn to outmaneuver them. Learning advanced maneuvers at the beginning will just cause frustration. However, while this tutorial cannot accomplish what only practice can, we can go over some of the basic 101 facts of air-to-air combat for those who may be completely new to it. Now, in a dogfight, when you're maneuvering against an enemy plane, your goal is to pursue or get behind the enemy plane, and that's his goal, is to get behind you and get his gun sight on you. Once you're in pursuit, there are basically 3 different kinds of curves or pursuits that you're in. And this is the basic, most 101 of anything in a dogfight. Now let's say that you're coming at this Bf-109, this German fighter plane. And let's say you're angled down towards him. The first pursuit curve is what's called a lag pursuit, where your nose is pointed behind him. Your gun sight is not on him. Now, this happens a lot whenever you're not able to turn faster than the enemy plane, or just in pretty much any scenario where you haven't been able to outmaneuver him yet. The next is what's called a pure pursuit, which is whenever your gun sight and your nose is pointed directly at the enemy plane. And this does not necessarily mean you're ready to shoot. It just depends on the situation and how hard you and the enemy plane are turning. And the last is what's called a lead pursuit, whenever your nose and gun sight are pointed ahead of the enemy plane. And this is probably the most useful of all of the pursuit curves. That's probably your main goal. Now, if both pilots in the scenario see each other before either one is able to sneak up on one another, then before any pursuit curves actually take place, usually this basic scenario happens. And that is that both pilots actually fly directly at one another in this situation, and they're eventually forced to bank to one side. Now, there are usually 2 ways this happens. Either one, they bank in the same basic direction, and they end up circling around and meeting each other once again, or they bank in opposite directions, which I find to be more common. Now, what happens when this occurs is the enemy planes will start to compete as to who can turn the sharpest. And this is what really gets you into the basic dogfight. And it kind of starts this figure-8 pattern. And depending on which plane can turn faster, it can just start nothing but a giant circle. Dogfights can many times just be a turn competition. So it's important to be patient and content with a lag pursuit as long as it's needed, and to be willing to bank away from the enemy once you are lined up and when you need to. Now, I cannot stress enough how important it is to be patient and sometimes content with a lag pursuit for a long time. Trying to force your crosshairs onto the enemy whenever your plane can't do it can result in a stall or a loss of control. A victory, however, will make the long wait well worth it. Now, dogfights for both skilled pilots and unskilled pilots can last a very long time, so it's important to cut down on your engine power and bring it back to a nice cruising speed, since you don't want to overheat it or destroy it. It's also important to remember to check your engine fuel, as you can burn a lot in a dogfight. I hope this tutorial has been helpful for anyone who is new to air-to-air combat and dogfighting, even though we didn't go over very many maneuvers or tips. Dogfighting is one of those things that mainly requires practice, and tutorials can only help so much in. That's all for this DCS tutorial. In the next DCS P-51 tutorial, we'll go over advanced operation and maneuvering, including fuel management and high altitude flight.